We dug in a little bit to a single verse in a way I generally try to avoid, but I thought it was an interesting verse. I thought it warranted taking a good look at it. And so which leads us to text number 19. 19. According to the three modes of material nature, there are three kinds of knowledge, action, and performer of action. Now hear them from me. We broke down the verse as a standalone last week. And we looked at cognitive and behavioral facets and the grammar of the verse and how the verse was actually used in grammatical cases. We looked at it as an analysis of how things get done in the world, kind of a philosophical, abstract way of looking at the world. And then it seemed fairly foreign to the way we would look at action. Sometimes you might say that desire motivates action and thoughts motivate action. So it's not entirely dissimilar to how you might break things down. You break down, in psychology, you break things down to covert and overt action. Covert action is thoughts and feelings. Overt action is actual things you do in this world. And so the verse, as enigmatic and abstract and philosophical and representative of a different culture as it is, it nonetheless, if you look at it right, it's not too difficult to see what's going on. So I looked at the verse as a standalone. And then we talked about the purpose of the verse, which is also important to understand what's being communicated, is why is this information here? I don't know. If you see a parent yelling at their child, and then, the reason why the parent is yelling at the child is extremely important. Sometimes the things the parent's saying just by themselves are enough to describe what's going on. Like, for instance, if you saw a parent with a child and the parent was saying to a 4-year-old child, "I wish I aborted you. I wish I never had you. I wish you would just die." Irrespective of, what the child had done to warrant the parent talking to them like that, pretty much that's a bad parent. Like an awful person. Treating their child and traumatizing their child, right in front of you. It's bad. I guess you could think of a theoretical, like what if there was somebody with a sniper rifle who was going to kill the child unless the parent spoke to the child and said those exact words. So you could come up with some sort of a thought experiment where there would be some, 1 in a billion situation that could arise. But for all intents and purposes, beyond a reasonable doubt, sometimes a parent, if they're speaking to a child in some way, then that means that the child's, being abused. I guess that'd be verbal abuse at that point. But, pretty serious verbal abuse, like call the authorities verbal abuse. Let's say if you saw a parent punching their 4-year-old child in the face with a closed fist. That's just, I can't possibly think. Again, we could do the sniper rifle thing. But barring that type of bizarre thought experiment, the action itself is enough to determine that, in this case, physical abuse was taking place. Sometimes it's more subtle. There's a famous break where children, when they get broken bones, there's a spiral fracture. The spiral fracture of your humerus. I guess it could also be was it the radius and the ulna? The ulna and the radial bone? These two bones? One of them's the ulna. I think the other one's called the radius. So there's two bones in your lower arm, and there's one bone in your upper arm. Just like there's two bones, there's your tibia and I guess fibia, and then there's your fibula. So there's one big bone, two small bones. One big bone, your humerus, two small bones, your ulna and your radius. So I guess it would be either one, but usually it's you see in the humerus. Sometimes a child will have a break of their humerus, and when they look at it, it's a spiral fracture, which is like a torque fracture, which means that a parent grabbed them by their arm and twisted their arm, and that broke their arm. I don't think it requires a tremendous amount of force, because mothers do make these kind of breaks. For sure, it's abusive to a small child, but it's not like you have to be the Hulk or something like that to accomplish this on a small child. Kid comes in with a spiral fracture to their arm. Pretty sure sign you're looking at physical abuse. You follow? What if your kid was walking in the street and was about to get hit by a car, and you grabbed their arm and ripped them out of the street and broke their arm ripping them out of the street, but saved their life? That's less of like a purely theoretical, like 1 in a billion chance. That's much more reasonable. So now if a kid came in with a spiral fracture, and and the parent had the story, that like there was an accident and my kid almost got killed and I ripped him out of a fire or whatever it might have been, and there was some corroborating evidence to support it, then that would be a reasonable explanation for what had happened, and it wouldn't necessarily be physical abuse. So sometimes something happens and the act itself fully explains things. You follow? The act itself explains things. I feel like not saying this, but somehow it came to my mind. I think it really describes the phenomenon. Imagine if you had a video of people having intercourse, and the woman was claiming that it was non-consensual and the man was claiming it was consensual. And in the video, you saw the woman kicking and screaming and fighting. That video evidence would convince a jury, a judge, the district attorney, beyond a reasonable doubt that what had occurred was rape. Without such evidence like that, it's much harder to get a conviction. Which is one of the reasons why sexual assaults go underreported, because it's hard to get a conviction. Because it becomes a he said, she said kind of situation. Sometimes an act by itself demonstrates that something terrible has occurred. Sometimes the act by itself doesn't demonstrate something terrible has occurred necessarily, and so you have to look at the motivations and the intent behind the act to figure out what exactly is going on. When looking at a crime that's occurred, you have your actus rea, your bad action, and then you have your mens reas, which is your mens rea and actus reus, Mens rea and actus reus. Bad intent, bad mind, and bad action. Mens for mind and actus for action. Both have to be bad. In general, you have to prove intent. Nowadays, the word intent has been replaced by purposeful and purposeful action. You had a purpose of knowledge and purposeful action. In other words, you either had a desire to do something, like something wrong to someone, like you had a desire to kill somebody, and that's why you ran them over with your car, purposeful action, or you were hitting with your car and you didn't really have the desire to kill them, but you knew they'd probably die from getting hit by your car. You just wanted to hit them with a car. You didn't really care whether they lived or died, but you knew there was a high probability they were going to die. They actually figured this out. So it's knowledge and purposeful action. Knowledgeable or purposeful action is what they've replaced this actus reus and mens rea with. And so it's an action which has an intent behind it. And the intent may be that you want to kill the person. Sometimes it's called malice aforethought, if you want to get into first-degree murder, where the person is purposefully lying in wait or going to a place to kill somebody. Versus second-degree murder, it's a crime of passion. Versus third-degree murder, it was reckless action on your part that resulted in the death of somebody. These things are important, and actually just as much as grammar is very philosophical, the law is also very philosophical. The law is also very philosophical. And when you look at a good, serious legal code, you're looking at people figuring out everything that could possibly happen in human society, what is fair and just, and how to properly adjudicate it so as to keep things fair and just. And so the law becomes this really pragmatic exercise in philosophy. So, theoretically, somebody could say, I wanted to hit him with my car. I wasn't really trying to kill him. Well, did you know there was a high likelihood he would die from getting hit? Yeah, but it wasn't really in my heart to kill him. I just wanted to hit him with my car. Okay, that counts as knowledgeable action versus purposeful action. You get it? So they divide it like this. And that's really the older term of mens rea, which is more difficult to prove, turned into something that is now like in most state legal codes and federal legal codes. That's what's used. So sometimes what you do is enough to figure out where somebody's coming from. But in many situations you'll find yourself in life, it's not just what you do, it's why you do it. And that why is huge. Imagine seeing two people buying a toy for a child. Two men are in a store buying a toy for a child. And they're discussing, what's an appropriate toy for a 6-year-old. And as they're walking out, you interview them. And one of the men says, I'm buying this toy for my child because it's his birthday. And the other man says, I'm grooming a child to sexually molest them, and so I'm buying the toy to get in the child's good books and lull them into a false sense of security so I can sexually assault them. Same act, buying a toy. But one of them is profoundly and deeply criminal, almost diabolical in nature. And the other one is loving, but the same act. You follow? A lot of times in life, why you do something is as important as what you do. In fact, in making a proper apology, one of the things you have to do is tell the person what you were thinking at the time. Because sometimes what you were thinking at the time is a mitigating circumstance, and it exonerates you to some extent. And it softens the person's heart that you did something too, because they understand better what was going through your mind. You follow? Sometimes it makes it worse if you're honest. If you want to apologize, you got to be honest. And so the worst thing is, if you're honest, and I'm sorry, that's not the worst thing. But it is, being honest is the problem. Worst thing is being dishonest. But if you're being honest, it can make it worse because you tell the person what you were thinking. Maybe they were giving you the benefit of the doubt. You're like, actually, it was worse than what you thought. I was trying to destroy your life. I was fully, envious and was wishing ill on you. I was trying to, I happened to bump you with my car, and you thought I was being reckless and drunk, but actually it was totally purposeful. I was attempting to kill you. And so being honest is dangerous. It can make things way worse. But it's required to make an apology because you're letting the person in and letting them know what you're thinking of. So anyway, why these verses are there, why these verses wind up in the Gita, it's quite clear from the context that what we're trying to do is help people become a little more detached from the world in which they live, from other people's actions, and sometimes from your own. For instance, let's say you're a soldier. Let's say you're a soldier and you are a sniper and you're ordered to kill someone because it's been deemed there's a credible threat and they are more like, I don't know what it is, there's different standards of evidence. There's a preponderance of evidence, which is 51%. And then there's clear and convincing evidence, which is more like 80. And then there's beyond a reasonable doubt, which is like 99 point something. There's no other logical explanation for it. Now, in a military situation where you're looking at improvised explosive devices, IEDs, and you're looking at S-vests, suicide vests, and things of that nature, and you're looking at people who look like civilians who are actually enemy combatants, and part of what they're doing is they're looking like civilians on purpose. They're using women and children to bring these explosive devices into proximity with your force. And then, there's a woman, she's got a suicide vest on, she's got something bulky under her clothing, and you get the green light. If you personify that, you think about the woman, as a mother, you're going to get paralyzed. You're not going to be able to do your job. And so sometimes to move forward and do what you need to do in life, you have to just figure out what your duty is and then just focus on that. Most of us will never be in such a situation. And so, we get to just pretend that we're more moral than we are, or we get to kind of disguise our cowardice as morality, and we never have to actually put ourselves into that situation. And so therefore we can sit in our armchairs and pontificate and philosophize from afar. But if you've got a police force, if you've got a military force, you want them to be able to kill and not to require a trial. They got to make decisions in an instant. Is it a dead man's switch? Do they have to press a button? Do they have the vest or not? What's the casualties going to be if they do? And you got to make a decision. You got a second to make the decision. And your training kicks in, and you've been taught what are the parameters, and you just obey the parameters, and that's what it is. The police officer, if they shoot somebody who has a toy gun, but they think the person has a real gun, it's tough luck, man. Don't play with toy guns around police officers. Parents, when you buy your child a toy gun, make sure they know not to play with a toy gun in front of a police officer. And you definitely don't want a toy gun that looks like a real gun. That's also a serious problem. And so it sucks, but you're dealing with people who are trained that if they see a gun, they shoot, and they have guns on them. So in that situation, and I guess I'm going to really put my foot in my mouth now. Breonna Taylor was killed in Louisville, Kentucky. And it's like a Lincoln Boulevard. It might not be called Lincoln Boulevard, but it's like everybody on one side of the street, that's the bad part of town. Everybody on the other side of the street is a good part of town. So she was living in the bad part of town, and the police had a no-knock warrant where they were trying to arrest a drug dealer. Her ex-boyfriend, who was a drug dealer, didn't live at the house anymore, but they had bad information. They thought he might be living in the house. He was actually in custody at the time, but they were serving a no-knock warrant on the guy who was already in custody. The cops rolled out there. They busted down the door, and then her boyfriend, her actual boyfriend, not the ex-boyfriend who was in custody, he had a gun. He woke up from in a stupor in the middle of the night, heard people breaking into their house, and got a gun out of the drawer and fired it. That was it. Half a dozen police officers unloaded their weapons in that vicinity. Somehow the boyfriend didn't die, but Breonna Taylor died. None of those police officers are guilty of anything. They were given the instruction to execute a no-knock warrant. Somebody fired a shot. They returned fire. That's what they're trying to do. They got families. They got to go home to their families. There's rules of engagement. They follow those rules of engagement. That's what it is. She won a $30 million lawsuit with the city of Louisville or whatever, the state. Great. Maybe she $50 million for her family. Whatever. I'm not saying there wasn't a mistake that was made, but the mistake that was made was in the laws that were formed. The mistake that was made in the people who gave the order. But the actual soldiers on the ground, those police officers, they were just doing what they're told to do. They don't go, I question this no-knock warrant. I want to see the evidence. The judge has to make a case to me why I should serve this no-knock. That's not the way it works. You get given your instructions. You go out there. You hear a fire. You hear a gunshot. That's it. You're done. That's it. You break out a knife in front of the cops. That's it. They don't have to use their stun guns. Somebody else just got convicted a couple days ago. She'll probably end up serving 10 years in prison. As a police officer. Can't remember. It might have been Minnesota or Michigan, one of those states. They stopped somebody. A white cop, black person they stopped. The guy tried to drive away. And she shot him. She said she thought it was a taser. But tasers just have a whole different feel. It's a whole different weapon. Of course, she said, taser alert, like she said, like she was going to tase the person. So it does seem like maybe that's what was going through her mind, although her training was terrible. She didn't have the presence of mind. And he was trying to drive away, and they tried to make an argument that, she thought her fellow officer was in danger, but he was clear of the vehicle. It gets tricky because when you're driving a car, the car is a deadly weapon. And so if you start to drive your car erratically, they kill you because you could drive and kill somebody with your car. Your car is a deadly weapon. If you drive your car erratically while trying to get away from police or flee a scene, you have a deadly weapon that you're operating, and therefore they can use. But there was no real reason. There was nobody around, and so there was no reason for it. Anyway, she got convicted of second-degree manslaughter and first-degree manslaughter. And so, this serious, probably 10 years in jail, what she'll end up serving. We'll find out, but, they're not taking it lightly anymore. But that kind of stuff, did she actually think her fellow officer was in danger? Was it reasonable? Like, if you touch me, like tap me on the shoulder and go, hey, Tukaram, and I turn around and like shoot you in the face. And I go, oh, when you tapped me, I thought you were going to kill me. It's like there is what I thought, but then I could be a crazy person, which is actually a defense. But there's what I thought, and then there's what a reasonable person would think. You follow? They do both. Were you afraid for your life? Would a reasonable person be afraid for their life? So anyway, all this minutia you get into, and it might seem overly detailed, but it's actually important. It's how you figure out who's guilty of what, who did what. It's how you make a proper apology is by getting into this kind of stuff and really making it clear where you're coming from. So what Krishna's trying to do here is he's trying to help Arjuna separate himself from two things. Number one is the actions of other people towards him, and number two is the actions he's going to have to commit by not thinking that it's just all about him and realizing there's a bigger picture and he's just, I guess, a pawn in all of it. You have to stay in your lane, know what you're supposed to do. Foot soldiers aren't supposed to act like generals, and generals aren't supposed to act like foot soldiers. If your general comes down the battlefield and picks up a gun and plays the role of a private, then he's not up, at the talk giving orders, at the TOC giving orders. And so, it's important for everybody to stay in their lane and play their roles. So the main purpose of explaining the facets of action and different ways to analyze action and thought is to help you realize it's not just you and that there's other factors at play. Did you guys follow that? Now we're going to take 3 of the 6 items we just described, and they're going to explain them according to a threefold schema called the gunas. This further creates some distance between you and action. And the gunas for today's discussion are simple. The gunas are, you have things which are healthy and uplifting, and everything in the world can be healthy and uplifting. So we can, for instance, drugs. A healthy and uplifting drug is a drug which is appropriate for the condition that you're suffering from, given in a legitimate way by someone who knows what they're doing, in a way which will not result in you getting addicted, and which is designed towards an overall journey towards health. Do you follow that? There's obviously an exception to this. That would be palliative care, where you're going to die and you're terminal and they're trying to minimize your pain. And then there'll be a different set of criterion of what health would be like if you were undergoing palliative care. Do you guys follow that? All right. I'm not trying to be comprehensive, but I'm just giving you kind of a general. So then you've got charity. Charity. Oh, I'm sorry. Then you've got mediocre. Mediocre would be, maybe it's not a drug which you're going to risk overdosing on, and the dosage isn't going to have long-term negative effects on your health. It's done more for recreational purposes. And it's kind of what most people do. It's sort of like fair to middling. It's kind of like mediocre. It's kind of like what most people do with their lives. And then you've got drugs which are high risk of overdose, high risk of addiction, long-term detrimental effects on your health, very, very no value whatsoever, and also being abused. So you've got kind of the healthy version of something, the mediocre version of something, and the detrimental version of something. And you can do that with human speech, with sex, with drugs, with music, with clothing, with food, with charity, with mindsets, with friends, with places where you live, etc., etc., etc. You can look at everything in the material world in terms of, is it progressive? Is it status quo, or is it deleterious and degenerating? That's the schema of the gunas for the purpose of today's discussion. I think that's sufficient for today's discussion. So now we're being told, according to the three modes of material nature, what I just said, healthy, status quo, degenerative. There are three kinds of knowledge, action, and the performer. So jnana, karma, and karta. So 3 of the 6 elements have been chosen out for special discussion to flesh out something which would probably be true for all 6 of the items. But 3 of them have been selected, kind of the main ones, knowledge, action, and then the doer, which would either be the actor or the knower, really. Parigyata and karta would probably be both included there. Anyway, the 6 things are broken up into 3 sets of 2, and there's one thing from each of the 3 sets of 2. There's a few ways you could break this down. But really, obviously, Krishna is doing a half exploration, and then the expectation would be that you would then be able to do it with the other 3 items that were not covered by Krishna. Did you follow that? Did you follow that?
No, I'm sorry.
You were spaced out. Okay. So there's 3 sets of 2, 6 items in total. 3 of them have been selected for Sonderhandlung, special handling, which is a term that was used by the Germans when they were exterminating the Jews. And the final solution, they would designate them for special handling. So it was a kind of an edgy joke. So 3 of the items were selected for fuller discussion. And 1 of each of the 3 pairs is included in the list. And there's an expectation that if you understand how to do this with the 3 items, you can then on your own do it with the other 3 and everything else you ever think about. And so there's uplifting, status quo, deleterious. And of course, status quo actually means slightly deleterious because of the sort of entropic effect of time in the world. So there's let's say, slightly veering downwards, dramatically and drastically veering downwards, and veering upwards. And so we're going to look at 3 of the items we just discussed. Now hear them from me. Here we go. That knowledge, so we're discussing knowledge, jnana. That knowledge by which one undivided spiritual nature is seen in all living entities. Here it's ekam bhavam. Ekam bhavam avyayam. There's one inexhaustible, imperishable nature that is ikshate, it's seen, sarva bhuteshu, in all beings. So avyaya, inexhaustible or unperishable, means spiritual. Because if you say eternal or non-decaying, that definition automatically indicates something which is permanent and forever, which would then indicate something which was functionally spiritual. Do you guys follow that? Now that's not exactly 100% true. I'd say that's mostly true. But for instance, the concept of numbers. Can you imagine any universe in a multiverse where the principle of first, second, and third didn't exist? No. It's relatively easy to imagine a world beyond time, or as time is one facet of the world. Even if you get into string theory, you get to some really funky, the upper dimensions, especially like above the 5th dimension and like 6, 7, 8, 9. They get really theoretical, extremely abstract. But the idea of numbers, not our particular cardinal numbers, but just the principle, first, second, third, and 1 or 2, a pair of something or a singular of something. I can't imagine a universe where that principle doesn't exist. Therefore, it would appear that there are certain concepts that are existing in every conceivable universe. Did you guys follow that? In that sense, they're universals. In that sense, they're primeval and fundamental. And you could almost argue that they were eternal. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they are spiritual. In general, with a few special exceptions, when we talk about eternal, undecaying, perennial things, we are talking about spiritual things which are contrasted to the temporary comings and goings of this world. Do you guys follow that? Okay. So, if you can see one nature forever in all living beings, so all living beings look different. That's why, we're more partial. They did studies that people are most attracted to people who look a little bit like them, actually. Like cousins seem to be like chosen, like first or second cousins are considered to be the most attracted by people. They share some features, but not too many. It's almost like a biological thing. They're close enough to your family to make a successful match, but not so close to your family that you're going to end up with the problems that incest creates in bloodlines. And so they did a study like this where they took, kind of cousins with different features that were unknown, and they did a study and they saw that people were rated as the most attractive people who looked somewhat similar to them. We do stuff for our family we wouldn't do for other people. We consider human beings to have more rights than animals. We consider animals we can relate to because they're like warm-bodied and fuzzy and whatever as having more value than, snakes or something like that, some cold-blooded reptile-type entity. And so the world, and then, just like the world is filled with different bodies, and we pick and choose who's most important. So in total contrast to that, if you can see that within everybody there is a common nature, which by definition means spiritual because it's said to be inexhaustible. So if you see that nature, that inexhaustible nature, then even though avibhaktam vibhakteshu. In all the differentiated, you see one undifferentiated. Vibhakta means divided. Actually, bhakti means to share. Not as a philosophical religious term, but in a secular usage. And so bhaj means to share, and so vibhakti means divided. And so vibhakteshu, amongst the divided, avibhakta, undivided. When you put an a in front of it, it becomes the opposite. Tat jnanam vidhi sattvikam. That jnana, know it to be sattvik, know it to be uplifting. That is probably the verse in the Gita which is the closest to making sattva, the uplifting thing, sound spiritual. In general, Krishna's treatment of the mode of sattva, the uplifting mode, is that it's still material. This is the one verse in the entire Gita where it would appear that you could take this verse and say this is a spiritual thing that's being described here. Do you follow? Anyway, in any case, it's uplifting. I have thoughts about, what to do with that, but we'll just save that for another day. The knowledge by which one sees it in every different body, there is a different type of living entity you should understand to be in the mode of passion. Okay, so what's the mode of passion? What everybody thinks. My tribe, my people, my sex, my race, my species, my countrymen. I'm Indian, I trust Indians more. I'm a Westerner, I trust Western people more. I'm from California, I hate the flyover states. I'm a Democrat, I hate Republicans. I'm a Republican, I hate Democrats. I'm a QAnon, I hate everybody. And so this is just kind of like what's normal. Kind of your average person who views a very divided, very separate, sectarian, very polarized world where it's us versus them. That person's in the mode of rajas. That's the average, slightly deteriorating. And that knowledge by which one is attached to one kind of work as the all in all, without knowledge of the truth, and which is very meager, is said to be in the mode of darkness. So, the knowledge that leads you to just see what's right in front of your face, you're not staying in your lane. You're just have a very extremely sectarian, extremely narrow-minded. It's all the bad features that were just described, but to a much greater extent. It's, it's like I said, the mode of passion is a little bit degenerating as opposed to this. And so they have certain features. So this is, I think, for the purpose of this discussion, you could say this verse, you're attached to one kind of work. So you're probably attached to your work in the second one. But you're incredibly attached to one kind of work, can't see the big picture, can't even value people who do anything else, think that's all there is, and you're super narrow-minded. So it's not just like I see different people and I got my tribe versus yours. It's like extremely narrow-minded. And it's meager, it's very small, and it's devoid of truth. So it's really, it's based on illusion. So maybe the way you distinguish things isn't even realistic. You're seeing differences between you and other people that aren't even there. So we've just run through knowledge. And one type of knowledge is uplifting, the other type of knowledge is mediocre, and the other type of knowledge is degenerating. Now, when you see people who are attached to one type of work and hate you because you're different, and you understand this verse of the Gita, then you won't be so offended because you realize they're being controlled by conditioning, which is not by choice, it's actually, they're just running out their code. They're just acting out their coding. Does that make sense? Also, when you start to feel this way, you recognize what's going on, and that recognition of what is happening provides you with space, and you can actually stop it from really dragging you down. You can question, is that logical, how I feel? Is that reasonable, how I feel? Is my attachment to this thing reasonable? Is it uplifting? Is it good? Is it healthy? And so both by looking at the kind of knowledge that you possess or are experiencing, and the knowledge which is motivating somebody else to act. Now, interestingly, you could just take this, and this could be part of you could just as easily change the language very slightly. You could say the actor who is attached to one type of work. The actor which sees this is all there is. The actor who feels like this. The knower who feels like this. You follow? And so it all eventually gets you back to the person. But you're seeing a person who's influenced by a particular type of knowledge. And you start to no longer see that they're your enemy or they're against you or they're choosing this. You see more that they're just stuck in that maelstrom. They're on that track and they can't really change it. Then you see yourself as stuck on a track. But the very act of seeing yourself caught on that track creates distance between you and that impoverished knowledge which drags you down and creates space for you to then choose whether you want to act on it or not. And so this information further creates separation between you and your actions, and it allows you to act in this world but not be of it, and to kind of sit on top of it and stay above the fray while leaping into the breach. And you want this kind of dispassion. Like if a police officer shoots somebody, let's say there's a guy with a knife, and the police officer shoots the person. And then there's a body cam, and the police officer says, yeah, I said 3 times, put the knife down. He took 6 steps towards me. He was 8 feet away from me. At that point, according to the training on manual, page 17 of our manual, it says I'm supposed to shoot him. And so I shot him, you know. Like that kind of a report is like, wow, this guy really, there wasn't any anger, there wasn't any getting caught up in the moment. He was really calm, cool, and collected. And he did just what he was supposed to do in that circumstance. And then that jury, that judge, that police officer, that soldier is not considered to be a criminal. They acted within the confines of the law. They acted appropriately in an appropriate circumstance, and they did so dispassionately, without running hot. And we value that. We actually demand it. In the voir dire process, we actually demanded of our juries that they have no pre-existing prejudices, which would make it impossible for them to fairly adjudicate and judge a case. Do you guys follow this? You know, a friend of mine, when I was a kid growing up, he committed suicide like decades and decades, right after I joined the Hare Krishna, so almost 30 years ago. But we grew up together. We lived together for a couple of years, you know, when I was a teenager. When I was 15 and 16, we lived together. His name was Jason, half Japanese, half American. We used to ride motorcycles together. And he had to lay his bike down one time on the freeway. And he was sliding on the ground. And I saw him, and he had road rash here, and he also had road rash here. And so he told me, he goes, yeah, I was laying on my side, and I was on the ground, and I was like, ooh, that's going to get bad. So I rolled over and then laid on my side on this side and figured I'd even it out so that I didn't have as much damage on me. And I was like, wow, that's some real presence of mind, you know? You're sliding down the road, you turn over to expose your other side. Like I was getting burned on this side, so I rolled over to get burned on this side, figuring I would wind up with less damage overall. I had 2 damage spots, but there were less damage. I could see the spot he'd worn out, and he rolled over to this side, and that side was less because he rolled over it was like a 60-40 thing. You follow? This happened. Well, I was 15. This happened 34 years ago, when I was 15 years old. But I still remember it because it showed a presence of mind, an ability to act dispassionately, an ability to think in a difficult time, to keep his head when everybody else would have lost theirs, and to move, strategically through the world. The action which is regulated and performed without attachment, without love or hatred, and without desire for fruitive results is in the mode of goodness. Now, this isn't exactly the same definition applied to action. So for knowledge, it's knowledge of the oneness of all beings. With action, it's detachment from the results and very much duty-based. But that action which is performed with great effort by one seeking to gratify his desires and acted from a sense of false ego, that's action in the mode of passion. Okay, so the second type, the mediocre type, what everybody does, the first one was the uplifting one. You're acting, but instead of getting enmeshed, you actually become uplifted as a result of acting. Your living in the world helps you to transcend it. You learn in the game of life. The other type of action, which is mediocre, which everybody does, it's super attached. You just want to win. You just want to enjoy. You're way more narrow-minded. You see way less of the big picture. You follow? And of course, if you don't get the results you want, you're miserable. If you get the results you want, you're elated, and there's no steadiness. That action performed in illusion, in disregard of scriptural injunctions, without concern for future bondage or for violence or distress caused to others, is in the mode of ignorance. So now, it's that same narrow-mindedness and desire to win, but maybe we flip it. You know, when they have like restorative justice, there's different models for justice. There's a punitive model of justice where you punish people, and it's based on the principle that if you punish people, it's therapeutic and it helps them to grow. It's edifying. That's why you call it a penitentiary. It's where people go to be penitent, where they go to feel regret for their actions. And there's a focus placed on reforming somebody. And so like if you go in front of a parole board, they look to see if you're reformed and if you're going to be a recidivist, if you're likely to reoffend, or if you've learned your lesson. That's the philosophy behind prisons. Things got messed up in like right around 1980. They privatized prisons in the U.S., which means they pay corporations. Corporations then get paid by the government to put people in prison. And they have contracts. And they have they're for profit. They're a corporation, so their whole purpose of existence is to make profit. And the less money they spend per prisoner, the more profit they make. And the more prisoners they have, the more profit they make. And the longer they keep those prisoners in prison, the more profit they make. So they started lobbying in Washington for longer prison sentences. That's the war on drugs. And so longer prison sentences, more prison sentences for crimes. So there was no decriminalizing of drug crimes. And you got longer mandatory sentencing. You follow? And they treated them terribly. They treated them terribly. And we have begun to incarcerate 7 times more people, 700% increase in our prison population in the U.S. in the last 40 years. Whereas our population in the U.S. is, not even doubled in the last 40 years. But our prison population is multiplied times 7. And there's a whole powerful multi-billion-dollar industry which lobbies to keep our laws stiff so they can keep those prisons populated so these corporations can make huge amounts of money. I personally think privatizing prisons is a terrible idea. Certain things should never be privatized. Prisons is probably like near the top of the list. It's just really, really bad because of the things I just described. So anyway, this is a huge shift from the original idea of penitence going on in a penitentiary and it becoming just about money. This has been recognized. There's a district attorney in Los Angeles. He just overturned 60,000 marijuana charges. Just dismissed them. So he didn't expunge them. He actually just dismissed them. Like they never happened. They're completely removed from people's records, going back decades. He just got rid of them. He just thought the whole thing was a joke. All the people we sent to prison for, a decade of their life for ganja-related crimes, he just wiped them out as if they never existed. And so the world's changing in this regard, but much to the chagrin of the privatized, the privateers of prisons who are just making tons of money, hand over fist. Another model of justice is restorative justice, which focuses less on punishment and more on restoring a relationship, reconciling, helping people to move on, helping people become better. And it's much less focused on punitive measures. A friend of mine, ombudsmen, mediators, they were very much involved in this kind of fancy thing called restorative justice. The thing with restorative justice is there is one thing that just kills the possibility of restorative justice, and that is if the person feels humiliated by the other person. When someone feels humiliated, wrongfully embarrassed, and condescended to, and this person dealt with them with contempt and condescension, and they're embarrassed, and it's been done wrongfully, and they've been victimized, and they're intensely angry about this, forced embarrassment caused by another. I'm just actually looking up the definition of humiliate real quick. Make someone feel ashamed and foolish by injuring their dignity and self-respect, especially publicly. So yeah, I like this definition better, but I think I was in the running. Yeah, humorless, to bring low, humble. And I'm wondering if, I never actually looked this up. Humus means soil in Latin. I didn't have enough time, but I didn't want to go on a whole thing, but this is what I do in my free time. I look up the etymology of words. And so humorless is to bring low. I'm wondering if humorless and humus share a common root of hume, which means earth. And so if you bring someone low, it means you bring them down to earth, which would be the etymology of both humble and humiliate. And then that would also be where the word earth comes from as well. To bring them low, to bring them to earth. We talk about, like straw in the street. You used to throw straw in the street, in case there was mud in the street, then it would make the street traversable. So straw in the street. Anyway, so that's one meaning of trina api sunichena, to be lower in the blade of grass, like that straw in the street. It's just cast about, to be stepped on. So that action performed in illusion, in disregard of scriptural injunctions, without concern for future bondage or for violence, distress, caused to others, is the mode of ignorance. The one time you can't mediate and mediation fails is when one party feels humiliated by the others. Because when one party feels humiliated by the other, they are willing to lose a lot, provided they can make that other party lose something too. So they'll go to jail. They'll lose tons of money to make you lose some money, to cause you some pain. And it's very much the mode of ignorance. Not worrying about future bondage, not worrying about violence, not worrying about hurting others, not worrying about hurting yourself. It's just destruction. It's like this darkness where you just want to destroy things and tear them down and pull them apart and ruin them. I don't think that everybody necessarily experiences that in a kind of a violent, aggressive way. That depends on your makeup. But I do think that it's a universal experience that when you feel humiliated, you want to do something to like a crab in a barrel, you want to bring the other party down. And so we should all, even if it's humbling, we should all be able to recognize this tendency and understand it as something to avoid. And of course, if you can understand something to avoid, if you can see it in yourself, then that you just open up space to choose it or not choose it, to move away from it. So the knowledge is about kind of seeing a oneness or a difference, right? And then, and then the lowest form of it is like you're super attached to your own thing and you can't really even see beyond just what's right around you. And then with regards to actions, detached action, which is uplifting, attached action, which is kind of in the middle, a little bit degrading, and then the action which is just for destructive purposes is in the mode of darkness. And by looking at the world like this, you can start to look at kind of the way you think about things and the way you move in this world. And you create space and you can start to uplift instead of degrade. And these two are a warm-up, because what do people do? The actor, the karta, the actor, the performer of karma, the actor. The actor has knowledge and does action. And therefore, the karta is the possessor of both the knowledge as well as the doer of the action. And now we deal with that, and it completes the discussion. Did you guys follow this? One who performs his duty without association with the modes of nature, which actually isn't what's said here. Because if you perform your duty without the modes of nature, then it's not sattvic because it's transcendental. You follow? So Prabhupada ran with it there. But that's fine. But mukta sangha means without bad association, without material attachment in this context. Na aham, anaham vadi, without thinking that I'm the doer. Without being self-centered, without thinking of oneself. Driti, firmly, utsaha, with enthusiasm, samamvata, endowed with both steadiness and enthusiasm. If you're steady, what do you generally lack? You just kind of put your nose to the grindstone, right? If you're enthusiastic, what do you generally lack? Steadiness. Just last for a little while. Here you're both. You're steady and you're enthusiastic. Siddhya siddhyo nirvikar. You don't change whether you're successful or not. Karta sattvika uchate. That's called an actor in the mode of goodness. In the uplifting mode. So, interestingly, it's this idea of being detached from the results. Now it's a person who's detached from the results, who doesn't waver. And so you see a linkage between the description of the action and the description of the actor. Because the actor is doing the action, and therefore some of the features of the uplifting action will also be features of the uplifting actor. Did you follow that? Like if I say you should do good action, what kind of person does a good action? A good person. You get it? You should do selfless action. What kind of person does selfless action? A selfless person. And so it makes sense that the adjectives which modified and defined the action also define the person. Did you guys follow that? The worker who's attached to work and the fruits of work, desiring to enjoy those fruits, who's greedy, envious, impure, and moved by joy and sorrow, is in the mode of passion. Okay, that's your average person. You're in it for yourself. You want to win. You're trying to enjoy. If you succeed, you're happy. If you don't succeed, you're miserable. And that's the action. And therefore, it's also the actor. And so you see a similarity between the way the action was described and the actor was described. And that's what most people do. It's a little degrading, but not terribly so. And then when that foments and gets to its worst form, the worker who's always engaged in work against the injunctions of Scripture, who's materialistic, obstinate, cheating, and expert in insulting others, who's lazy, always morose, and procrastinating, is said to be a worker in the mode of ignorance. So the last guy was at least active and trying to enjoy. This guy's a cheater and a lazy jerk and is paralyzed and can't move forward and just kind of a couch potato. So he's like all the bad qualities, and he's also lazy. And that's in the mode of ignorance. So you see how Krishna took the ideas of the last verse we looked at with the 6 things, divided into 3 sets of 2. He took a sample of each of the 3 pairs. He then broke them down into the modes, which then has the result of you not taking offense when people do such things to you, and you also looking at your own actions, and that creating space, and then you can choose how to uplift yourself. And all of this stuff is material, but it creates a separation between you and the action, you and the knowledge, you and other people, and allows you to more expertly be in this world and cut through the world and do the right thing for the right reason and not get attached. And we've got a whopping 20 seconds left. Thank you very much, IGTV. You guys can hang on Facebook for a second if you want to. You guys want to give me some feedback?